I have a memory that's etched in my mind from my time in the Philippines, and it is of this day, Good Friday, where after the service, like we are doing today, they would gather together at about sunset, and they would have this reenactment of the burial of Christ, a lovely little ritual among many rituals in the Philippines they do. This great devotion called Santo Entierro, which is like the holy burial of Christ. And what will happen at sunset, the dead Christ is entombed in a casket and we go around the streets of the parish. And because the sun is setting, it's a lovely devotion ritual that we are walking with the dead Christ. And there's only a few people gathered in the evening, but as we move around the streets, people would come out with their lighted candles to pay their respect for the dead. And then as we come back to the parish, usually after about an hour or two of processing around, we'd be among the other saints like Mary Magdalene and St. Peter and those we heard in the Gospel. And I was just thinking about it today. It's been quite very strong in my mind. I thought it's a lovely kind of gesture. It's a lovely token, walking with the Christ, and that kind of sense of the funeral, or walking with the dead Christ, as we ourselves know what it's like to attend the funeral, to walk, to go to the wake and to remember the people. So this is what we're sort of celebrating today, but really, it's not really the end of a story. Today's story we heard in John's Gospel, if you like, it seemed to begin and end with a garden. Did you notice that? That we are told in the first reading, in the Gospel, the beginning of the Gospel story, there we have Jesus having spent the night, we were there last night ourselves, spending the night in prayer, agonizing in the garden, wasn't it? The Garden of Gethsemane. And it was in this garden that Jesus spoke to the Father at great length. Father, if you can let me go without this suffering, let it pass, but not my will, let yours be done. And so for ourselves, we reenacted that last night. After the Last Supper, the Mass of the Last Supper, some of us may have gone and prayed at the altar of repose in union with Christ, who is in the garden. So this garden seems to be a garden of death and a garden of agony. And it's from this garden that Jesus is taken, and we've heard the trial and the sufferings and the difficulty that he entered into and he had to go through. But then at the end of this story, we are told of another garden. And in this garden, we are told there's a tomb. It's an empty tomb, and it's made by, carved out by Joseph of Arimathea, one of those rich, chief priests, Pharisees rather. There was a Pharisee, Joseph of Arimathea, who came to Jesus at his time of death to pay respect and to bring the body down and to put it into the tomb, his own tomb. And the thing is that this was a new tomb that only kings were laid, the rich and the mighty. So there's a bit of an interesting thing there, that from the garden of death becomes another garden of death. But this garden of death becomes a garden of life, because as we know, the story continues, but we'll just stop there. But we know the story, we know where the story ends, that out from the garden comes life. So there we've had a garden of death to a garden of life. And it might remind us of another story. That is, we go all the way back to Genesis, and we're told of God creating this beautiful garden. We'll call it the Garden of Eden. And there in that garden, he breathed into man, and man became a living being. And from that man was given all the fruits and all the plants, and he was told to till and in the soil and make life be happy. And he lived very happy because he had a beautiful wife, Eve. Eve was fashioned from Adam, as the story goes. And then in that garden, we're told that God walked in the cool of the evening. It sounds blissful. It sounds paradise. It sounds full of love and full of life. But from that garden of life became a garden of death, because as we heard about Eve taking the fruit from the tree, and in disobedience, the Lord said, you can eat from any trees in this garden, but not from the one in the middle, because then you will be like God. And so we know that we don't have to go through the story. We know the temptation, and Eve takes the apple, or it's not an apple, a bit of fruit from the tree, and there we see sin, disobedience come into the world. And what happens then? They hide, they're ashamed, and in the throes of death, God comes looking for them. Where are you? Adam says, we were naked, and that's why we hid. And from then on, we're told that God said, now that you've ate from that tree, sorry, you're out of here. And so the garden of life became a garden of death. They were banished from that garden. And so, my friends, there's been a story from the first garden where man and woman tilled and enjoyed life with God. From that time on, God was about a work of restoring the garden. A garden at the beginning became life to death. The garden we hear today became from death to life. And my friends, if you like, we are that garden. We are that garden that God, again, walks through and says, where are you? And some of us saying, we're afraid, we're hiding. But God says, do not be afraid, because your ransom has been paid. That as we come together on this day, we will remember Christ who died, who was buried in that garden for love of us, so that we might live. And he makes us that garden where he dwells. He makes that garden of us where we can bloom in the love of God, where we can grow and be strengthened, because we know that God has given us life again. And we invite others to that garden, just like a normal garden in our own houses, in our own home. We take great delight for life to flow from that garden. But we know also our gardens at home, sometimes as winter comes and autumn, they become dead places. Places of death and places of life. Places of life and places of death. And see the cycle that continues in the garden of life. So let's, as we come to this day, we are told in the second reading, I think it was, let's approach the throne of grace. And what is that throne of grace? But it is the cross. That's the throne of grace. To approach this throne of grace with confidence, not out of fear, not out of terror, but knowing that God has given us this great place where we can approach in confidence. And it says, approach the throne of mercy. And there, at the throne of mercy, at the cross, is the grace that we need in time of our need. He is the one who's bore our sufferings. He is the one who's taken upon himself our burdens. He has been crushed. That is true. We've heard it in the readings today. But having been crushed and having been able to be buried, we watch, we wait with him in the garden to see that another story will begin again. And that will be the garden of life eternal, the garden that sees no more death, the garden that sees no more banishment. It's a garden of life that we are invited to and to live forever.